The 10 greatest UFC fighters of all time. That's what I want to discuss in this video today, guys. The criteria, you see it on the screen. The quality of wins is obviously going to be the most important thing when it comes to a fighter's career. The longevity is also very important. How long were you able to stay on top? Title wins, they do matter. They aren't the be all end all, but title wins do count for something, and losses are important. I feel like a lot of people say, it doesn't matter if this guy has 50 losses, you know? He's the GOAT. He fought past his prime. I do think that fighting past your prime does affect your legacy, and you'll see that in this video on why I have some guys lower than others. So with that being said, with this criteria out of the way, let's get right into the video. Starting off at the number 10 spot, Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva is holding on by a thread to that top 10 spot. If a guy like Merab gets 1 or 2 wins, I would not mind putting Merab above him. But currently, as it still stands, I still have Anderson Silva in my top 10, hanging on by a thread. UFC record of 17-7. At once, it was 16-0. He started off his UFC career on a 16-fight win streak, and then obviously he went 1-7, which does hurt his legacy. If Anderson Silva never lost in the UFC and retired undefeated, then maybe you can have him in your top 5, and I wouldn't mind it. Another thing that goes against Anderson Silva for me personally is that he didn't have the greatest level of competition. That does go against him. If you look at his notable wins, he does have a win over Dan Henderson, Damian Maia, Vitor Belfort, the GOAT, undisputed, undefeated Chael Sonnen twice, and Rich Franklin twice as well. I don't know why I didn't put twice, but yes. And he also has 11 title wins with 10 title defenses. So with all that being said, although people will argue that Anderson Silva's competition was never that great and he had a lot of losses at the end of his career, I do think there is something to be said about being champion for 7 years, finishing 14 of your 16 fights in your 16 win streak, having the longest win streak in UFC history, 11 title wins with 10 title defenses, which is the second most of all time, with decent competition, not great. For me, with all that being said, I do think he still clings on to the number 10 spot for me personally. So with that being said, I have Anderson Silva at the 10. Moving on to the 9, we're going to have Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now, Khabib Nurmagomedov, I can't put him any higher than 9 just because he retired too early, in my opinion. He's missing that factor of longevity for me. Khabib only had 13 fights in the UFC. That is on the lower part of this video of most fighters. 13-0 in the UFC, only 4 title wins, notable wins at the end of his career. He submitted Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, and Conor McGregor back-to-back, which was very important. He also has wins over Edson Barboza, one of the greatest strikers we've ever seen in lightweight history, and Rafael dos Anjos, which was in his prime. That was an underrated win back in the day. He dominated RDA. But the thing that goes against Khabib for me is that he did beat the fighters in front of him, but his style was never really challenged. He never fought that Charles Oliveira or that Tony Ferguson. You know, a lot of the guys he fought and beat, like Justin, Dustin, and Conor, were all strikers. And it is very impressive that Khabib was able to go undefeated his entire mixed martial arts career. That's unheard of. No other fighter does that, maybe outside of like Jon Jones, which that is still questionable. But Khabib only having 4 title wins and retiring very early and not having a long title reign, I think that bumps him down further down the list for me personally, because a lot of guys have Khabib in their top 5, right? And the reason I don't put him in my top 5 is because lack of quality of wins, of course. He has good wins, but he doesn't have enough of them. And he also has a lack of longevity. He retired at 32 years old in his prime. Obviously, he had some outside factors that made that decision for him. But with all that being said, I think Khabib at the number 9 spot, still in the top 10, is amazing. And he is the second greatest lightweight now behind Islam, in my opinion. But still amazing. It's unheard of in MMA, as I said, to go undefeated. So shout out to Khabib. I have him at the number 9 spot. Moving on to the number 8 spot, Daniel Cormier, the Mr. Cheeseburger over here. A UFC record of 11-3. A lot of people don't know that Daniel Cormier didn't make his UFC or MMA debut till he was 30 years old. So the fact that he did everything he did after age 30 is very impressive. And he was also wrestled in the Olympics. For DC, a UFC record of 11-3, only 3 losses coming from Jon Jones and Stipe Miocic, only losing to the best of the best, arguably the greatest heavyweight and light heavyweight in UFC history. 6 title wins. And another thing is, he was a double champion at light heavyweight and heavyweight, and he defended a title in both divisions. A defense against Volkan Oezdemir and a defense against Derek Lewis. Notable wins, Derek Lewis, Stipe Miocic, granted an eye poke. 2 wins over Prime Rumble, which is absolutely insane when Rumble was undefeated outside of the DC fight for a long time. Alexander Gustafsson, that was a great win. Ragdolled Dan Henderson, not the best version, but still ragdolled him. And an underrated win against Frank Mir back in the day. And he also has a win over a guy like Roy Nelson and Josh Barnett. But I didn't put that as notable wins. Either way, DC was the Strike Force heavyweight Grand Prix champion. He debuted in the UFC at heavyweight, didn't want to fight his friend Cain Velasquez. for the heavyweight title. So he moved down to light heavyweight, and or he was never able to become technically the best fighter in that division because Jon Jones was always the best in that light heavyweight division. He was able to get a win over Stipe, a knockout win, and end his heavyweight run and become the heavyweight champion and defend that title as well. So when you factor in that Daniel Cormier is one of the only double champs outside of like Amanda Nunes to defend both titles that he won a belt in, or in both titles in both the divisions he won in, he had a defense of it. It's very impressive. 6 title wins. Like I said, it does go against him a little bit that he did lose to Stipe twice and he lost to Jones once. So he was technically never the best light heavyweight or heavyweight of his division. But nonetheless, DC, an absolute legend and has one of the best physiques we've ever seen in MMA. So I have him at the number 8 spot. Moving on to the next fighter on this list, Stipe Miocic. I have him slightly above Daniel Cormier. A UFC record of 14-5. I mean, you can argue 14-4 because that Jon Jones loss, that was a shadow of Stipe. But at the end of the day, he did choose to keep fighting, so it does go in his record. 6 title wins. He's only lost to the best of the absolute best. Stipe lost to Stefan Struve way back when, before he was in his prime. He has a loss to Junior Dos Santos, which he avenged. He has a loss to Francis Ngannou, but he also beat Francis Ngannou. He has a loss to DC, which he also beat DC. So Stipe Miocic, outside of Stefan Struve, has defeated every single fighter he's ever fought, outside of Struve and Jones. That's impressive in itself. 6 title wins. He knocked out Fabricio Doom for the belt, right? Went on a generational run, broke the heavyweight title defense record, got 3 title defenses at heavyweight, which is still the current standing record. Notable wins, 2 wins over Daniel Cormier, which is impressive because he got knocked out by Daniel Cormier in their first fight. A win over Francis Ngannou, a win over Junior Dos Santos, a win over Alistair Overeem, and knockout over Prime Fabricio Verdum. Very impressive. Stipe had the longevity. He was in the UFC for a long time. He was beating the top guys, and he did it all with basically just good footwork, boxing, and wrestling. That was what he used to get his title run down, and man, he was knocking everybody out. He was the first guy to defeat Francis Ngannou in the UFC, I believe. Completely dominated him. He was the he beat Daniel Cormier 2 times after getting knocked out by him. He came back and knocked out Junior Dos Santos. He knocked out Alistair Overeem. He knocked out Fabricio Verdum. That's the thing, man. Not only was Stipe going on an insane title run, he was also knocking out all of his opponents and just outboxing them. And Alistair Overeem clearly felt the tap, but it didn't matter because Stipe got him on top of him and pounded him out. But yes, Stipe Miocic with a UFC record of 14-5 and 6 title wins. With the wins that he has, I have him as my number 7 greatest fighter of all time. And yeah, moving on to the number 6 spot, Jose Aldo. Listen, my last GOAT list, I had Jose Aldo at number 3, but as you guys know, I kind of changed my perspective on Jose Aldo, and I looked more at his losses. I looked more of how long he's been fighting. I do factor in the longevity, but his losses do matter. And the fact that he's lost to every single featherweight champion outside of Ilia Topuria does throw him down in the rankings a little bit in terms of the top greatest fighters of all time. I don't see how anyone has Jose Aldo in their top 3 or 4 after, like, you have to factor losses. And a lot of guys will disagree with this take. They'll say, nah, dude, losses don't matter. Like, he's fighting past his prime. These losses should matter. Look at what Jose Aldo did in his prime. That's great. But at the end of the day, if you're a fighter like Jose Aldo and you choose to fight past your prime, it does go against your record. You can't just get a million losses and it doesn't do anything, you know? He has a UFC record of 14-8. He started off in the UFC 7-0, so he's went 7-8 since losing to Conor McGregor. He has a negative record. He does have 7 title wins. He did go on a 10-year undefeated streak before losing his belt to Conor McGregor with wins over guys like, or title defenses over guys like Chad Mendes, the Korean Zombie, Frankie Edgar. He has 2 wins over him. He has 2 wins over Chad Mendes. He has a win over Renato Moicano, a win over Marlon Vera Raufont. So it is impressive that Jose Aldo reigned over the featherweight division for as long as he did. And in the latter half of his career, he was able to go down to bantamweight and have more success there. And he has 7 title wins. He's one of the greatest featherweights of all time. I don't think he's the greatest featherweight of all time. I think that lies to Volkanovski. But Jose Aldo has the best longevity, arguably, of anybody on this entire list. Maybe borrow Jon Jones, but this guy's been around since he was like 21. I think he became WEC champion when he was like 21, 22. And the fact that he's still ranked as a top 15 fighter in the UFC in 2025 at 38 years old is absolutely crazy. His longevity is off the charts. But I do think his losses and how he's lost to every single featherweight great in the UFC outside of Ilia Topuria, and he has losses and been finished at bantamweight as well. I do think that Jose Aldo does get notched down to the number 6 spot for me. And like I said, man, it doesn't mean that he's not great. I mean, we're talking about the 6th greatest fighter ever. So people that think I'm discrediting Jose Aldo, I just think the fighters above him in the next 5 spots are better. That doesn't mean Jose Aldo is still number 6 of all time, dude. There's been thousands of fighters in the UFC, or at least a little bit over 1,000. Being number 6, there's no shame in that. Jose Aldo is an amazing fighter. But nonetheless, I have him at my number 6 spot. Moving on to the number 5 spot, I have Alexander Volkanovski. Listen, Volkanovski's obviously 1-3 in his last 4. However, before he lost to Islam the first time, he was undefeated in the UFC, 12-0, pound for pound #1 fighter in the world, 3 wins over Max Holloway, which is insane. A win over Yair Rodriguez, a win over Brian Ortega, a win over Jose Aldo, a win over Chad Mendez. I mean, look at the featherweight greats he's beaten. Volkanovski is the perfect example of like quality over quantity. He doesn't have a lot of great wins, but the great wins he has are amazing. Like and that fight with Islam, man, imagine if the fight with Islam went his way and he beat Islam Makhachev, ending his win streak. But he didn't, obviously. And Volkanovski is on a 2-fight losing streak by knockout. But at the end of the day, he still has 6 title wins. He has arguably not the most longevity in the world. He's been in the UFC, I think, like 9 years. So not the longest in the world. A lot of guys that have the crazy longevity, like Aldo, have been in the UFC like 15 years, or maybe not 15, maybe 14 years. Either way, that's a long time. But Volkanovski kind of burst onto the scene out of nowhere, took Max Holloway's belt being relatively unknown, came back and beat him 2 more times to have 3 wins, and dominated Max Holloway in that 3rd fight. And obviously, he's been on a bit of a downturn lately. But let me just say, guys, if Volkanovski is able to come back and win the belt against Diego Lopez, and then able to come back and defend it against maybe a Mavzar and somebody else, and get 3 more title defenses, and have 1 title reign with 5 title defenses, and another one with 3, I wouldn't mind putting Volkanovski at like number 2 or 3 on my list. But the fact that he is on a 2-fight losing streak, or both by knockout, he is 1-3 in his last 4. I do think that bumps him down. A lot of people had Volkanovski as number 3 or 4 on the list. I do think it bumps him down to number 5. But let's see how he looks against Diego Lopez. But at his current state, I think Alexander Volkanovski at the 5 spot is fair. 6 title wins, a UFC record of 13-3. Faced the absolute elite of elite. The competition that Volkanovski has faced is second to none, and the win streak and what he was able to accomplish is amazing. So I think the number 5 fighter of all time is more than fair. Moving on to the next spot, I do have Islam Makhachev above him, and a lot of people are going to disagree with this. But listen, Islam Makhachev has a UFC record of 16-1. He's on a 15-fight win streak against great competition, at least on the latter half of his win streak. Great competition, 16-1. The second longest win streak in UFC history. If he gets 1 more win, he ties Anderson Silva for the longest win streak. He has the most title defenses in lightweight history at 4. He has 5 title wins. Notable wins, Hinata Moicano easily submitted him in the first round. 2 wins over Volkanovski, although you can argue it's like a 1.5 because his second time was a fat Volk off the couch. A win over Dustin Poirier, choked him out. Choked out Charles Oliveira, who was on an 11-fight win streak with 10 finishes at the time. Choked out Dan Hooker, or bent his arm until he tapped, and beat Arman Tsarukyan back in the day, which is a great win. And not the best of Arman Tsarukyan wins because he was 22 at the time, but still a win over Arman Tsarukyan. And he still has wins over guys like Drew Dober, Bobby Green, who are really good journeymen, Thiago Moises, all those guys, Davey Ramos, all those guys are decent journeymen. So I think people underrate Islam Makhachev's like quality of opponents and just say, oh man, he just fought a bunch of featherweights. Like, yeah, sometimes most of the greatest lightweights are featherweights. Dustin Poirier came from featherweight. Charles Oliveira came from featherweight. Dan Hooker fought at featherweight. You know what I'm saying? Some of the Hinata Moicano fought at featherweight. Some of the greatest featherweights are the best lightweights. That's just the reality of it. So to discredit Islam's legacy just by saying he fought at featherweights is just ridiculous. And the reason I put him over Volkanovski is, 1, he has 2 wins over Volkanovski. He has a longer win streak. He has 1 less title wins. He has more finishes in his title reign. 8 out of 9 of his last fights were finished. So I think with all that being said, in my opinion, Islam is above Volkanovski just slightly. Listen, if Volkanovski goes out there and defeats Diego Lopez, I would slide Volkanovski right back over Islam at the 4th spot. But being that Volkanovski is on a 2-fight losing streak, and you know he got knocked out in both, I do think you have to edge Islam above him, given Islam's recent activity, his finishing ability, the level of opponents he's faced recently. He ended Volkanovski and Charles Oliveira's legendary win streaks. Volk was on a 12-fight win streak, and Oliveira was on an 11-fight win streak. So nobody talks about that. And he beat them both, and they were at the top of the pound-for-pound ranking. So yes, I have Islam Makhachev at my number 4 spot. And for Islam, if he goes out there and defeats Ilia Topuria, I don't mind putting him at number 3 and maybe even getting close to edging him past GSP, because he would tie the official UFC record for the longest win streak. So yeah, Islam at my number 4 spot. Moving on to the number 3 spot, I have Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson. Now, a lot of people are going to hate this, and they're going to say that Demetrius Johnson shouldn't be in the top 3. Dude, you're talking about levels of competition. But listen, man, DJ had a UFC record of 15-1. Oh, it's 15-2 technically, not 15-1. That's my mistake. He lost to Dominic Cruz and Henry Cejudo in the UFC, but 12 title wins with 11 title defenses, the most title defenses in UFC history. What hits at DJ is his level of competition. That's no secret. Henry Cejudo, John Dodson twice, Joseph Benavidez twice. Outside of that, you're kind of grasping at straws. But the fact that this guy was able to go to the one championship and get another record of 5-1 and capture that belt and defend it against a guy who knocked him out and came back and knocked him out the same way. Listen, I do not mind if you drop Demetrious Johnson all the way down to number 6, 5, or 4 under those other guys. I'm giving Demetrious Johnson the respect because he has insane longevity. He doesn't have a lot of losses, and he was on the UFC champion for a long time. He was literally like emoting on guys. He was so far ahead of his division. But if you want to put Aldo, Makhachev, and Volkanovski above DJ and put DJ at like the 6 or the 7, I would not mind that one bit. But I do think you have to factor in how long he was on top, the most title defenses in UFC history, only 2 losses in the UFC with 15 wins. And yeah, man, going across multiple organizations and as long as he's did it, and one of the most well-rounded fighters in history. When you talk about greatness, Demetrious Johnson is the embodiment of like just being a well-rounded mixed martial artist to its core. And yeah, I respect DJ a lot, but I have him at that number 3 spot. I am probably highballing a little bit. Like I said, 6, 5, or 4 would be fair as well. But Demetrious Johnson at the number 3 spot. Let's move on to the next one. Number 2, Georges St-Pierre. It's very obvious. Georges St-Pierre, still one of the greatest UFC fighters, the second greatest to ever do it. GSP had a record of 20-2. And what's impressive about GSP is he defeated every single fighter he's ever faced. Funny enough, GSP has only lost to fighters named Matt, which I find hilarious. But a UFC record of 20-2, which is absolutely insane. And he also defeated those 2 fighters that he lost to. 12 title wins with 9 title defenses at welterweight. He had 2 separate welterweight reigns because he did lose his belt against Matt Serra and then destroyed him in the rematch. He also was an interim welterweight champion. And he was eventually a UFC middleweight champion. But I don't rank the double champ status too high on GSP because it was Michael Bisping. But notable wins. Michael Bisping, a prime Johnny Hendricks. Very close fight, but he did win in my opinion. A win over prime Nick Diaz. A win over prime Carlos Condit. 2 wins over prime BJ Penn. And 2 wins over prime Matt Hughes. And yeah, man, Georges St-Pierre, he had the longevity. He never popped for PEDs. 12 title wins. A champion in 2 different divisions. 9 title defenses at welterweight. Was champion in the welterweight division for nearly or around 7 years. Very impressive. And GSP, in my opinion, was ahead of his time. You know, this guy was one of the most well-rounded fighters in UFC history, and he had no wrestling background. He developed his wrestling, as amazing as it was, in like MMA training. He wasn't a collegiate wrestler. He wasn't an Olympian, but GSP had some of the greatest MMA wrestling we've ever seen. He now holds the second most takedowns in UFC history at 90. Marab recently passed him. And yeah, man, GSP had nasty boxing. He had a great jab. He had great elbows, as shown against the Michael Bisping fight. He was elbowing him to oblivion. He had a great ground game, and earlier in his career, he was finishing a lot of guys. But after GSP lost to Matt Serra, he definitely took a more measured approach and had a lot more decision wins towards the end of his career. But when you look at GSP, how he's beaten every single fighter he's ever faced, 20-2 record in the UFC is insane. 12 title wins, welterweight GOAT. I do think it's fair to put Georges St-Pierre as the greatest fighter of all time, right behind none other than Jon Jones at number 1. Listen. You guys know I don't like Jon Jones. That's not a secret. His personal life and just the way he's went about the end of his UFC career, I don't have to say much about it. But we're going to ignore all that for this video. We're talking about Jon Jones and his resume. And there's no denying that despite all the nonsense he's done, Jon Jones has the greatest resume in UFC history. And it's not really that close. I think he's a good bit ahead of GSP. UFC record of 22-1. 15 title wins. Arguably should be 22-2 if you count the Dominic Reyes loss. But on paper, 22-1 in the UFC. 15 title wins, and the one loss he has was BS. It was against Matt Hamill due to 12-6 elbows, which is an absolutely ridiculous rule. But Jon Jones has been on top of the UFC since he was 23 years old, becoming the youngest champion in UFC history. And even in 2025, at 37 years old, he's still the heavyweight champion, borrowed a kind of a paper heavyweight champion. But notable wins: Cyril Gane defeated a prime Cyril Gane easily in the first round after making his heavyweight debut. Beat up prime Thiago Santos. 2 wins over prime Gustafsson. Or 1 win over prime Gustafsson and 1 win over, maybe a little bit past his prime Gustafsson. 1 win over Daniel Cormier. The second one was overturned due to roids. A win over a prime Glover Teixeira. Listen, Glover was on like a 21 fight win streak whenever John beat him. So that's a really impressive win. Submitted Vitor Belfort, who is arguably near his prime. Beat up Rashad Evans. Choked out Lyoto Machida, who was still in his prime. Beat close to a prime Rampage Jackson. I do think Rampage's prime was closer to like the Pride days, but a good version. And he knocked out Shogun for the belt. So yes, Jon Jones, with his longevity of being on top of the UFC for 15 years now, never really losing a fight, bar the Dominic Reyes fight. And like I said, I do think that the ducking of his career and the roids do play a factor, but the UFC fans don't seem to care about it, so I'm not going to factor it that much. When you talk about longevity, quality of wins, losses, And yeah, if you look at all that and title wins, he has the most title wins in UFC history. He has one of the longest win streaks in UFC history. He has the most total title defenses in UFC history. He's beaten the most former champions out of any UFC fighter ever. He's been on top for 15 years. There's no denying that Jon Jones is the quote-unquote greatest fighter of all time. I'd like to call him the GOAT over the GOAT, but nonetheless, across the board, Jon Jones pretty much is the GOAT of the sport, and yeah, there's not much to disagree about on that. So that's ultimately my top 10, guys. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'm out. Peace.